Good evening. A very warm welcome to everyone. It's very moving to see how many people have come to actually take this opportunity to remember Hari Vasudevan. That's the main objective of this gathering, although there are more people to remember, and a key figure in all of this is Hari's mother, M.Sreekumari Vasudevan, and we'll come to that. But the IIC had a very special place in Hari's time in Delhi and beyond, and there were many occasions where he curated events and curated exhibitions. And in fact, the gallery of the program room, leading up to the program room, still has one of these very fine posters, which one of the last exhibitions which Hari conducted on Indo-Soviet relations. I want to go into a particular focus. This is not necessarily the focus that the speakers I have invited to join us are necessarily going to follow, but this is an initial kind of invitation to think about a specific book which Hari has brought out posthumously with my mother. Let me come to that in a short while. The book is on display outside, and it's been put together with great love and care by my brother in relationship to the growing up of my mother from her childhood until the 1950s when she got married. But first, let me pay my respects, along with you, to Hari Shankar Vasudevan, my brother. He was, as you know, a highly respected scholar and much-loved teacher of Russian and European history. Hari was educated in Nairobi and Cambridge. He taught for over 40 years at the Department of History, Calcutta University, and served with distinction at the Academy of Third World Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, and as director, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad Institute for Asian Studies. In the 1990s, Hari, along with Sobanlal Dattagupta and Purabi Roy, undertook a sustained research and publication project to make material on pre-independence Indo-Soviet relations in the Moscow archives available to scholars. He was also chairperson of the National Council for Education and Research Training at a very important juncture. It was a period of great innovation. He chaired the revision of social science textbooks. It was a time when we saw an entire new generation of academics entering the domain of textbook writing, substantially remapping the field, and it was, I think, a period of great pleasure for Hari as well, in association with many academics, and especially Krishna Kumar, who unfortunately is not able to be with us today. In recent years, there are a multitude of initiatives, projects that Hari undertook. Amongst these related more generally to Central Asia, and to the history of the French in India. And in collaboration with Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, a radiating globality project which explored genealogies of modernity outside the metropolitan West. Professor Spivak recently delivered the second memorial lecture in honor of Hari. After retiring from Calcutta University, Hari joined the Observer Research Foundation and was invited to head the governing council of the Institute for Development Studies, Kolkata. At the IDSK, in the last period, before he was cruelly taken by COVID, he was keenly engaged in developing projects around the early years of Indian independence, including one on the Constituent Assembly. He was also interested in India's first experience of mass suffrage and the putting together of the planned economy. I should briefly mention the publications which Hari put out. These include a translation in 1997 of key Russian texts, Commercialization and Agriculture in Late Imperial Russia, which he argued yielded cautionary lessons for the liberalizing recipe of unfettered international trade and private enterprise for the evolution of a healthy economy. He researched a book on Indian trade and military cooperation with Russia after 1991, and then in 2006 undertook a most remarkable overland trip to trace the journey of Afanasy Nikitin, a 15th century Russian trader, to India. This was a venture Hari undertook in the company of journalists, filmmakers, an energy expert, and travel writers. and he recorded it in a book entitled In the Footsteps of Afnasi Nikitin, Travels Through Eurasia and India in the 21st Century. It's a composition remarkable for the fluidity with which the narrative of cultural encounters moves from the 15th century to the Soviet era and the post-Soviet conjuncture of the 2000s. Hari also wrote extensively in newspapers and in online portals to meet the surging interest in understanding the breakup of the Soviet Union and its implications for India. We can only lament the loss of the scholarly and gauged insight he would have offered us in the shocking circumstances of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But now let me come to the main event of this evening, which is to focus on this book, which he brought out in collaboration with our mother, Memories of a Malabar Lady, M.Sreekumari Vasudevan's reminiscences of life with K.S. Menon, Justice K.S. Menon. This also, for me, signposts. Sorry about that. Kindly. Sorry. Yeah. This, for me, signposts what the thematic for me, the history at home. It emerged from a decade of conversations, if not more. In fact, I have kind of almost primal scene memories when I would be lying in bed next to Hari and Amma, and they would be continuously chattering about, times past. And this would have been going on from the time of my childhood. I don't think it was a fantasy scene, but I do remember very clearly. And this relentless curiosity, which my brother possessed, about everyone and everything, and to find out where they came from, what their lives were about, what shaped them. And this was really a characteristic of him. And it was not through the usual way we go about recording testimony, recording with innumerable tapes. It was through little notebooks which Hari would take down over time and accumulate these. Initially, he, I think, had no plan to make this a publication for the general public. He thought it would be something of interest to the family, to himself surely, and more generally for circulation, perhaps amongst friends. But as time developed, and as he worked with his publishers at Manohar, in particular Siddharth Chaudhary, who was his editor for a couple of books, Siddharth persuaded him, look, Hari, if you actually kind of frame this and kind of clarify for a general audience, there will be an interest in this kind of memoir of a woman growing up, moving from traditional circumstances into an ever-changing modern world in the colonial and in the post-colonial period. So he undertook this seriously. I think it's an index of what the text was meant to be, that when Tapati was clearing up things recently, she found a myriad copies of the book, as if it was primarily meant just for circulation amongst the family, rather than to assume a public form as a book. But it did undergo that change. And what happened here is, I think, two or three dynamics. One is, of course, the dynamic that the professional historian will bring to the home and bring to the family. That dynamic is that you bring with you a wherewithal of expertise, of ways of looking at sources, of ways of situating events, people, families, personalities, and with a background and a series of backgrounds. It's not adequate just to say this was Sreekumari, her sisters, her father, etc. You say, where did these people come from? What were the sources of this transformation? What happened in the pre-colonial period? What agrarian transformations, transformation in property relationships actually frame the family as it was emerging in the early 20th century. So a lot of that professional expertise is now brought to bear. So it's as if there's a move from the account for family consumption to something which is the professional historian's remit. It's what their obligation is how to situate this in terms of historical transformation. So we have that element coming in, and that's very much, I think, the function of a professional historian entering the home and trying to frame a relationship to the home and his parents and the family as it evolved. But I want to draw another dimension, your attention to another dimension of the historian writing at home. This is the archive, And historians cannot think of the act of writing or composing history without an archive. My mother had many interests, and you will see this as you go through the book. And I think Lakshmi and Arunima are very keen to actually talk about some of that as well. Apart from her skills as a wonderful and indeed legendary cook in the family, she loved drawing flowers, which she had left. There were these paintings which Hari would kind of blow up, scan, and make look extremely glossy and with a high resolution, which would festoon our various homes. She loved, of course, music, and this was actually music across the board. So it's, Hindustani and Carnatic, the kind of school ground ditties which you would pick up, nursery rhymes, and music from popular Hindi films from her time, especially in Jodhpur. So, and formidable memory, which enabled her to recite verbatim long hymns, prayers, which again, all of which were recorded by Hari. So you actually have the composition of a personal archive, a home archive, and to add to which the family movie, the home movie, became another dimension which was brought into place by my father, who was a kind of inveterate kind of 8mm kind of movie maker. So all of that is assembled, some of it is digitized. So that's one other reference point. The other one is the question of writing and what exactly the historian does with the act of writing when it's done in collaboration. So this is not the historian, just the professional historian standing above and outside. It's the historian now being inside the home, in conversation with his mother, and actually generating a narrative. Now he admits, and if you look at the acknowledgements, the introduction, he says that, look, there is a way I actually formulated this narrative. There are ways in which I took literary license in order to actually to frame the way she was talking about things. But the basic structure of storytelling, the understanding of history, the way in which the family history evolved was very much hers. And the words, the idioms, phrases were hers. But it is through this particular dynamic and interaction that the historian actually works with this person, and not simply, and I would argue, not just in terms of there's collaboration, and there's another dimension. The last 10 years of my mother's life was spent with Hari. And it is here that I would say that the historian is not only working on the project of history, but he's working on the project of his history as a vehicle of care. Now, caring is actually a complicated thing. To care for older people, how to actually minister to them, not just in terms of physical security, health, even your emotional presence, but to actually make lives meaningful. How narration of history, your own biography, becomes a way of actually cohering, giving meaning, giving a sense of a life lived. That itself is actually a challenge. And that, I think, is where the empathetic historian, in conversation with his mother, actually draws out this dimension. So care as a critical vector of how exactly the narrative is fashioned, and also information, memory, images are solicited and evoked from the person, becomes another, I think, crucial dimension. But I think this is not one way. It is not just the historian taking care through history, if you want, of this individual and her biography, of her. It is a care of the self, the historian himself shaping and evoking a sense of the meanings of his life before he was there, the family legacies which he was inheritor of. There's a way in which, in fact, if we look at just this last image, at the image to the left, we will see this sense of Hari positioning himself in time, in the family, and in relationship to an extremely dear aunt of ours who unfortunately passed in December, Dr. Sharada Menon, in her house in Orms Road in Chennai. And here, Hari is actually holding this family photograph, He is one layer of time, and she is. Inside the photograph are herself, her sister, that is my mother, another sister, the grandfather, and as if there's a layering of time, which is actually being built with a self-awareness about how the historian is positioning himself in relationship to this. The care of the self is not only the care of this biographical entity whom you are bringing into being, but it is your own biography or an extension of it. So the historian at home actually evokes this sensibility as well, the sensibility of myself in time and through the frame of the family and its destinies. So this I found particularly suggestive when I look at these photographs. I'll come to a conclusion here. As I said, this is my reflections on the book. You'll find a lot of, I think, interest in how it's been framed and shaped. But I would also invite you, obviously, not necessarily to inhabit the frame I have offered you. There may be many, many other directions you and, of course, Arunima and Lakshmi might like to take this. But I would, before I hand it over to them, like to express my deep thanks for the number of people who have actually made this possible, not only in terms of their contributions, in terms of the material in the book, photographs, all sorts of references, a map, a family tree. There are all sorts of things which had to be assembled for the book. But especially even putting the book together, even financially in terms of the event which is taking place around us. I'd especially, and from the depth of my heart, thank Narayani Gupta, Radhika Singha, N. Hari Bhaskar, Madhavan Palat, and Tapati Guha Thakurta for the generosity with which they actually supported this project right through to its conclusion. I owe special gratitude to our speakers for this evening, Lakshmi Subramaniam and G. Arunima. Hari's close friends, they immediately agreed to participate in this event. There was no question, and entirely at their own cost, which I'm very grateful to and rather embarrassed about. I would also like to thank Ms. Tete Tochong, who has been with me in fashioning this event from the outset. So now the structure of the evening as it follows, I will just invite both Lakshmi and Arunima in succession, and I must introduce you. I hope you don't feel embarrassed that I do that. Lakshmi Subramaniam is a leading scholar of trade and empire, of the history of indigenous economic networks, and of the institutions of modern Carnatic music. Her recent research has focused on the object worlds of the modern office and home, undertaken in collaboration with the Godrej Archives. Lakshmi taught for many years at Calcutta University, was professor at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata, and is currently visiting professor BITS Pilani at its Goa campus. G. Arunima is a leading scholar of the family in Kerala and the author of a major book on the subject, There Comes Papa, Colonialism and the Transformation of Matriliny in Kerala from 1860 to 1940. Arunima is a key architect in the formation and development of the Gender Studies Center at Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she is professor. Currently, she is director, Kerala Council for Historical Research. So thank you. May I invite Lakshmi first to actually make her presentation? Yes. Wherever you're comfortable. I don't think we should insist on this.
I'll speak
okay?
from here. Yeah. Thanks, Ravi. It's going to be difficult. I mean, a lot of things that I wanted to say have sort of been tangentially touched by Ravi. But let me, nonetheless, start by saying this is really a very special occasion for me to celebrate the launch of a book that's actually taken shape, which is co-authored by Hari Vasudevan and M.Sreekumari Vasudevan, both of whom I knew very intimately, and both of whom we lost in 2020. Hari, of course, had spoken to me of the project constantly. I mean, of course, Ravi has heard him all his life, but ever since I've known Hari, he always would say how he was assembling these memories, and he would also urge me to do the same with my parents, who are in their 90s, and kept saying, this is very important. So I sort of knew the book in its making before it got processed as a proper book. So I've seen it in the form of a spiral copy with very meticulous handwritten notes. But now that I actually have got it in a book form, I decided to read it a little differently. I didn't sort of just react to it as, which is a delightful set of memories, but I wanted to engage with it a little more seriously. I was also reminded, as I read the memories of a Malabar Lady, I was reminded of the many memoirs I've read. I was thinking of the memoirs of Janaki Mazumdar, whom we taught as part of a course on history and memory, gender, the making of the self. And I was also struck by how much there was in common with certain kinds of memories written by certain kinds of women in certain kinds of locations, and how dissimilar also this was. So in many ways, it's like a diary in some cases. This is like a set of reminiscences that is recorded by Hari. But in all this, in this particular book, I actually found the voice of Sreekumari Menon emerge quite strongly. So I completely recognize the critical role that Hari played as an interlocutor, in this conversation. And certainly, I think what Ravi said about the caring self and how he actually cared for this whole exercise. I also found a lot coming out of the pages, which was really the voice of the protagonist. So I, in fact, am going to stay with that. What struck me about the book, and I want to say this at the very start, is the extraordinary quality of detail. It is something that really stayed with me. Every experience that she went through, everything she wanted to speak about as she was growing up is recorded in this flawless detail. And I want to stay with this quality of detail and what it did for me as somebody who was reading it as a memoir of someone I knew and loved, but also as somebody who practices history and is looking at this material in relation to other issues that we think about when we think of archive, home, history, etc. So this is something that I do want to actually stay with. Now, I'm not suggesting that we cannot ask other more complicated questions about memory and history. This is indeed a treasure trove of information. It's about, it gives you a really intimate glimpse into a household, and of its incredibly intrepid cosmopolitan head of the household. So there is a lot of the personality of Justice K.S. Menon, whom she refers to as Daddy, and also of this entire experience of a ritual lifestyle and a modern lifestyle being braided. And of course, the reminiscences are very valuable in thinking about domestic space in a changing modern India, if you will. But I, as I said, want to reflect on the protagonist herself, especially on the affection she seems to have had for the entire family, but particularly for her parents, for her very frank recall of their personalities. There is something spontaneous, simple, enthusiastic, and you never feel that this has been overlaid with extraneous, patina. It's like what she felt, she says, and she seems to have remembered it, perfectly. So that's something I really enjoyed. And of course, the enthusiasm that she had to learning, general learning, whether it was cooking from their favorite cook, or whether it was what she learned from her mother, the various Sanskrit slokas that she heard as a child, for her tremendous enthusiasm for music of all kinds, Carnatic, classical, choral, Hindi film, and she writes about it quite elegantly, and botany, which I was really impressed with. She writes this about her moments in Beaulieu in Coonoor, where she actually develops this interest in flowers, classification, form, petal, which she then hones in her own way. And of course, the ease with which she seems to have negotiated multiple cultures. I think all of these things came through to me very directly, and I felt this was something which one can really respond to. Here is somebody who says all this. We can read it, we can make a lot of it when we write our own history of growing up in modern India in the 40s, but there was something much more that peeped out from the pages, and that's really what I'd like to stay with. Now, that the house and the home were central to her social identity is without doubt. She was born in 1926. Her early years really recall her life with her father, whose work life spanned a very critical moment in the last years of the British Raj and the early development of the Nehruvian state. And she says, quite frankly, that she was not very interested in the politics of nationalism or state building. She actually says this, and one, therefore, might just stop with that. But actually, on close reading, what you do find is a very keen observation of the everyday. So as a result, the memories actually offer a very unreconstructed invocation of the quotidian. Just what it was like to grow up in that particular location with that particular household. And this is really tellingly described in the chapters on Chingalpet, Madras and Malabar. And she records how the Chingalpet years were the happiest in her life. She got to know her siblings, she got to know songs, and it's all done through the lens of school and school education. I also absolutely enjoyed the way she recalls her mother as quite different, very devout, very strict, and the ways in which she talks about, no to any fancy dress, no to any fancy footwear, and then they would play hooky and nonetheless get this footwear. And also absolutely no extravagant traveling in the salon style, and the kids were actually forced to travel inter. And just the way she sort of puts it and the personality of the mother is recalled, I found that actually quite fascinating. Now, I do want to go back to this idea of national belonging. Now, it's true that she doesn't speak very much. She says that she did not particularly feel a sense of national belonging. There is, however, throughout the book, a very tactile sense of accommodation, of an exposure to very diverse kinds of people and situations. Very diverse social interactions that seems to have spanned right through the period of this work. I mean, right as she was growing up, whom she ate with, who came, who went, and the kind of responses she had to diverse communities. She lived in a Tamil Brahmin household, and she talks about how Diwali was spent in a way that was not particularly familiar with Keralites. She talks about her, her friends who were Muslims. She talks about, she was particularly fond of the nuns, and I think the Christian factor made a huge impact on her life. And so one is really struck by the nature of social interactions. And across communities, across class, and therefore I found a real empathy in the way she remembered. So, of course, there is empathy in the way in which it is written, and that was Hari, but I could also see the way in which she remembered with empathy. And I was particularly struck by the way she referred to friends in her Jodhpur days. I loved one of the descriptions of Om. I didn't get the title, I don't know the surname of this girl. She was obviously from modest means, was not nourished well, but she was the star of the university, did very well, was very kind, and then her sort of life was cut short by cancer. So this empathy that she uses, in recalling some of her friendships, I found very touching. And in fact, I would say there is a great deal of empathy in the book. With siblings, with illness, some battling depression, some sick, with her mother's own sort of failing condition and eventual demise, is sort of recalled with simplicity, but also with a matter-of-factness that again makes a very direct impact on you. There is something which is not overlaid with anything. So out of the lines, for me, really peeped out this young girl who seems to have absorbed, seemingly without much fuss, the experiences of life, the changes that followed in her own identity. There is something very matter-of-fact about the account, her reflections on what is modern, what is fashionable, did you feel this, did you feel that, and the readiness with which she was able to just move. If her father said, let's travel, she traveled. I think only one of the decisions when she said she wanted to complete her education in Rajasthan was sort of emphatically said, and I really liked that portion too. So for me, in the book, of course, the home is important, and there's some fascinating descriptions of the ways in which things were arranged. But for me, travel seems to be the real leitmotif of the book. And it sort of really assumes an important position, particularly traveling out of Malabar to Rajasthan. So for me, the book was as much about travel as it was about the homes that emerge as the archive of memory. The recall of the rail trips, traveling by various classes, the services accorded to railway stations, the food that was packed, always ready to travel. This whole memory is sort of stored in the very act of travel. And that sort of comes through very, very elegantly in the book. There's also not much sense of resistance. You know, it seems the children were prepared to travel as their father decided, as I said, except in the case when she said she wanted to complete her education in Rajasthan. I would like to spend a bit of time and reflect on two facets of Amma's retelling of her life, and which I really found particularly both moving but also very relevant. One was her lifelong attachment to music. It's something that really comes through in the book, right from her school days when she would recall a nursery rhyme that was sung, or the way in which her father would recall an Irishman singing something, or what she learned from from her college mates in Jodhpur, or what she learned, when she learned Carnatic music. So I did find this lifelong attachment to music, which is something that several members of that generation and social class shared. And this is something that I have been responsive to. She sort of loved music with what she heard, and she enjoyed. As I said, it was very diverse, very eclectic. And I recall this attachment because every time I met her, she would refer to her favorite compositions, and I would be struck by two things. I'd be struck by a very familiar repertoire of songs that she would always talk about. There would be definitely 3 or 4 compositions in Telugu, 2 or 3 songs in Tamil. And this was something I was very struck by, partly because I was trying to put together something of my mother's musical life. And it was incredible to see how much of overlap there was, because my mother sort of grew up in Trivandrum, and she learned from her first teacher was a music teacher from Trivandrum. And so I would then, I would be struck by even the ways in which some of these were rendered. So I had this interest in what was current, what circulated. And I think I was really struck by this extraordinary impact listening to music seems to have made on so many women of that generation, across social status, location, and they were always constantly moving. My mother too, she moved from Trivandrum to Madurai to Pollachi to Chengalpet. So it was like constant moving. And yet music seems to have been this sort of golden thread. So that was something I was really struck with, and it's something that comes out very vividly in the book. The other thing was the way in which the listening habit was consolidated. And there is a very interesting section on the radio, on gramophone, on her father's patronage of important sabhas, even in Delhi. And so you get a sense of how an incipient music taste actually gets consolidated. And that's something that I sort of was struck by. I was also struck by her eclectic response to music. Probably because of her exposure to, to classical music, particularly via Shanno Khurana in Jodhpur. But I think it was really something that she just responded naturally, because she kept saying, she would always talk to me about certain Tyagaraja songs and say, hum it for me, hum it for me. So I realized that there was something quite deep about this attachment to music. The second facet that I really that comes out very nicely in the book is her appreciation of botany and flowers. I mean, I always would wonder how she knew every name and every form, and she would say, this is the way you embroider an aster, this is the way you draw a poinsettia, and she would do it. She would show me her greeting card, she would show me her embroidered stuff. And now when I read the book and I think about the enjoyment she had in Kunur, particularly in Bolyu, where her father might have even sort of bought a house in Millhaven, of course, then fate intervened in the form of Vasudevan. So that's a different story. So the book sort of ends with her early married life and the birth of her children. And I was almost sad to see the pages run out, because I was really hoping to get more tidbits of life in Africa. And the raconteur that was Hari, and we know Hari was a great raconteur. He was able to actually pull things out of, out of the hat. And the fact that he had this extraordinary memory to go by really made the book for me a treat to read. And I know many of us will devour this for all the details and the potential, but I just want to say here that I want to insist that I really read it with no overriding considerations, but pure joy. And it's some of that joy that I've tried to share with you this evening. So thank you.
Before I hand this over to Arunima, I should mention Shanno Khurana is in the audience.
Oh, really?
Okay, okay.
It's an honor to speak when such a great artist is in the audience. Well, like Lakshmi, I must say I'm here mainly out of my great affection and great admiration for Hari Vasudevan. Unlike Lakshmi, I wasn't his colleague. I met his mother only once, and he met mine only once. But we were friends from the very first time I met him in 1986, along with Tapati. In fact, I stayed in a flat of their friends that was empty just as I landed in England to study. I went to Oxford for very odd and complicated reasons which are not worth detailing here. But I was just telling Ravi that the next morning after waking up, I walked over to their place, and what do I see but Hari standing and flipping pancakes? And he said, "Here, there's a pancake for you for breakfast." And that's how we became friends. And this is a friendship that lasted until just a few days before he passed away. He sent me a message for Vishu. Usually we spoke. We had 2 very long biannual conversations, one on Vishu and one on Onam, in which everything under the sun was spoken about. But one part of that would always be about our mothers. And his mother had just passed away. And I will come to that in a minute. And I hadn't phoned him, I had written to him. And he messaged me saying, wishing you you and Amma a happy Vishu. And I feel terribly, terribly sad that I wrote back to him saying, wish you the same, I'll call you soon. And I never did. So there's a great sense of an incomplete conversation, a Vishu conversation that never happened, and many, many others. So this book, about which both Hari's brother Ravi has just spoken, and has a very lovely foreword in it, and he spoke a little bit from there in a far more formal voice. The foreword here is very, very nicely written. It's really a very interesting text in the sense that it really has 3 kinds of trackings. It has a small foreword by Ravi, which really looks at Hari's life and how he grew up and where he studied and where he traveled and the man that he was, both scholar and family man. And he was both, and a great, great friend to everybody, so much so that we all felt that we were one of his closest friends. Hari's own introduction, which is written in an exceedingly formal tone, as he thinks a professional historian ought to write. Now, I have no idea why he wrote it in that tone, frankly speaking, and why history should be written in that tone, because soon after that, the same person writes Sreekumari Vasudevan. He's the ghostwriter of this text, and he writes it in an entirely different register. So if you are able to transact these different registers, why do you choose this formal tone? I mean, in fact, a lot of the early history, Malabar family, this, that, and all of that. I mean, for people who don't know that history, it would be an interesting read, I'm sure. I kept thinking, oh, come on, move on, let's have something else here. And the last bit, the very last bit, which starts tracking the families, his own families, the Mambalikalathil, Taravad's own history, actually becomes more interesting, and there's a slightly more personal tone there, even though there's an ancestor whom he never names. He's always called the sub-judge. Everybody else has a name. He's always referred to as the sub-judge, and I kept wondering, what did this man do that you don't like him? You don't want his name in there. So there are interesting things about the narrative and the tone, and I think that is something we do need to think about. And I want to actually think about this form of narration a little bit, because that actually raised many questions for me, apart from the fact of, what is it that we do when we write family histories? And what do we do with memory and voice, affect and time, all the kinds of things that Ravi and Lakshmi have just been speaking about. I will also touch on those a little quickly. Now, what's interesting here is the kind of way in which the story is told. And you read it as though she is telling the story as a child growing up into a young woman. That is the tone of voice that you are actually reading here. And that is an extraordinary achievement, even if, as Ravi said, and he speaks about this in the foreword too, even if you had detailed notes of interviews that were done, actually, with Amma, it isn't easy to actually consolidate that in the process of writing. It's not actually easy to produce a narrative of this kind. And what that kind of narrative does is that when you read Hari's introduction, which gives you a formal kind of history of, Malabar family, partitions, land, matrilineal, this, that, and then moving on to the colonial story, the wider sort of story of civil services, what's actually happening in colonial government, and so on and so forth. Sreekumari Vasudevan's narrative actually doesn't speak to this at all. It undoes it in some ways. And that's the kind of, uncomfortable relationship. I mean, it's not a sort of consciously uncomfortable relationship, but there's something about that tone. There's something about the way in which her story is being spoken about, that it is not illustrative of that past. And therefore, we do need to think, I think those of us who do waste a bit of our life writing about families and histories and so on, must think about it, which is that even though Mambalikalam and Malabar weave in and out of her memories and this narrative and so on, and it is one of the reference points in this story, her story is actually a kind of a tale of a peripatetic diasporic life, a kind of non-resident, in today's terminology, a Maranadan Malayalis, a non-resident Malayali story. And she's actually twice removed, in the sense that it's the father who moves and she goes with him. So the father is changing, but is in this complicated relationship with Kerala, Malabar, Malayalam, being an Nair and so on, and being a civil servant. But she's not bogged down by any of those things. That is not the reference point of this memoir. And so it was very interesting for me, because a large part of my conversation with Hari, in the many decades I knew him, was about Malabar and about family histories. Well, one tiny part of it had to do with the fact that when I wrote up my thesis, he was one of the people I sent it to. I packed it up and posted it to him, because my supervisor, his closest friend, wasn't reading any word of it. Now, Hari, of course, as you all know, was a very loyal friend, and he wouldn't hear any word against his closest friend, but he did agree immediately. And somewhere in my box of notes, I do have his meticulously written comments about the thesis and his questions and so on, which really helped me rework it later. Now, precisely because of this, all our conversations, Kerala loomed very large, and I kept trying to push him out of this sort of Malabar Marimakatayam, Tarawad focus kind of thing, which of course he was open to. It's not that he wasn't. I mean, after all, the Nikitan story is so interesting for all of those reasons, and he was so widely read and just thought of so many things, but he would still come back to Malabar somewhere. So in some ways, this narrative is also about a kind of quest for Hari, it seems to me, far more than Sreekumari Vasudevan sort of thinking about Mambaligalathil. I think it is Hari Vasudevan thinking about Mambaligalathil, and I think that is a really interesting issue that one may want to think about as one reads this. So of course, as Lakshmi just spoke of, and Ravi before that, you have these places that she's going to, Madras and Chengalpet and various other places, ending up in Jodhpur and so on. Now, K.S. Menon, Sreekumari's father, is a bit like the main protagonist in the supposedly first modern novel in Malayalam, Indulekha. This is the Indulekha that Chandu Menon never wrote, right? This is a different story. So this is where, so in Indulekha, the story ends with Madhavan going off. He gets into the civil services, and he moves to Madras with Indulekha and his dad in tow. But in this book, it's as though K.S. Menon as Madhavan is stepping out of those pages as a civil servant and working in different parts of the Madras presidency until he skips out, and out of colonial service, that is, and enters the Jodhpur Raja service. So in some ways, there's the world of the colonial state, the princely state, and it's quite seamless, and they seem to come together, at least in this narrative, quite closely, and there doesn't seem to be a huge friction there, which also is something that historians perhaps need to think about when one thinks about it via the sort of familial history of retelling the story of professionals of this period. So this is not about the work he did. This is about the life he had. And there doesn't seem to be such a huge disconnect there. Now, his trajectory in many ways seems to be more like another Malayali who left Kerala about half a century earlier, which is Raja Ravi Varma. And it is that kind of movement. Of course, he went to many more princely states, but spent a substantial amount of time in Bombay, as many of us know. Now, Ravi Varma was known to this family, and he did draw one of the early portraits of the Tharwad Karnavar and their family, the Kerkepat Krishna Menon family. Now, I remember when I wrote a paper on this a very long time back, I sent it to Tapati and Hari wrote back to me very punctiliously saying, by the way, when you got that name wrong, it's not Kerkepalat, it's Kerkepat. And then he sent me references to family members I was supposed to contact and interview, which of course I didn't do, and now I have misplaced them, so I shall go back to Tapati and hope that she has some of those names with her. But I did wonder whether the name Malabar Lady was a sort of small bow to Ravi Varma's Malabar Lady portrait, and Hari being quite he had a sort of wicked sense of humor, so perhaps it is that. Now, this story, the family is really with the parents, right? It's a world of a child growing up, picking up details of what was a really large family. So it wasn't that she didn't need to live in a joint family. Her own family was pretty huge. Now, the interesting thing that struck me is that even though we are told that she went to all these places, Chengalpet, Madras, Bangalore, etc., it isn't really so much about the places, as it were, but far more about relationships. It's really kinship and friendship that seemed to create a sense of belonging. And one part of this could have been that she had a very sheltered life. Now, it's very interesting that she does return to Jodhpur as a college student. Lakshmi was speaking about that. And at this point, she doesn't stay with her father because her father's not there anymore. And that's when she really got a sense of a different city. She saw that there were streets and shops, and she started cutting across railway lines and jumping in and out of stationary railway carriages and doing the kinds of things young people normally do. So she clearly wasn't sitting in a sedan and wasn't being driven around. She was having a jolly good time. So there is something about freedom and mobility that was possible for young women who were brought up with far greater rules and boundaries in a time like this, and of course in our country even today. Now, this kind of recollection of growing up in a family raised all manners of questions for me. How do individual stories intersect with histories of the family or the region? Or a changing social or political context? How would both of these be mutually inflected? In other words, if one was to rewrite the history of Malabar or Kerala or Malayalam itself via the vantage point of a non-resident Malayali, of a Maranadan Malayali, would these same places, these categories, acquire a different meaning? Meaning the kind of fixity of meaning that we assume that we give to place or language or region, would these be unmoored? Would there be other ways to think about it? And I have little quotes from the book. She says at one point, I'm asked what these joint families meant to me and what the Tarawad meant to me. I must say that they meant what I think family means. For me, my father was the central figure in the Tarawad house at Mambalikalam, and my mother handled most of its important affairs. She does speak about the fact that, her parents' generation had a far greater sense of, belonging to matrilineal joint families, but she certainly didn't have it, and, that didn't bother her either. She also says, interestingly enough, that I found the bathrooms in Malabar disconcerting. There's the consistent going back, which many of us, I had a Maranadan Malayali moment there. The toilets were in the Indian style at some distance from the house and normally had to be reached through some messy and unkempt sections of the compound, and I'll leave it there. Now, the second part of what I want to think about here is the way affect works in this entire text. Now, early feminist and social historians have been very interested in recovering women's or people's voices generally. People in memory studies or anthropologists work with different forms of oral testimony. And so, there is a great interest in the way in which voice and orality works. Now here, I thought that memory worked. The work it seemed to be doing was through the nuances of relationships within the family. So there are very detailed observations about the relationships between the parents, between siblings, a lot of it, with minute details of a childhood spent together. Lots and lots of really closely observed, details about interests and peculiarities and funny anecdotes, how naughty the younger of the brothers was, Goku, whom most of us know as M.G.K. Menon. So it was all very difficult to reconcile that in my head as I was reading. Oh, really? Okay, all right, if you say so. Now, the other interesting thing there was that there was an expectation that the sons would study and probably go abroad and have professions, and the daughters would marry. But interestingly enough, if any daughter studied well, she was also encouraged. And this is something that we see, of course, Sharada Menon being one example, but even her sister Leela was another example of somebody who did study and aspire to a different future. But she also speaks at length about illness, pregnancies, and I was very struck by the fact that she spoke about menarche and menstruation, and I was struck by the fact that there was that degree of trust and ease between mother and son to be able to speak about issues of this kind while writing, while remembering her childhood. So, and which I find really very unusual, because many mothers wouldn't speak about this, certainly not mine. But also what is interesting is a memory of flashes of anger, be it a parents or a siblings. and a far greater candor and sensitivity than many of us can actually muster about both physical and mental health issues in the family. But that aside, she also notes, Lakshmi spoke about it, and I think it's very striking, especially when women read a text of this kind, because she speaks repeatedly at different points about not ever having had fashionable or fancy frocks, like many amongst. I thought, oh, that's really bad. I felt that amongst her classmates or children or people known to them. But the interesting thing is that this doesn't come across as envy. It's really to do, she felt that her mother was parsimonious, but this was a big family, and probably the mother's economies had to do with the fact that she had to manage this large family. And she probably also had imbibed a very different ethic, which was common to people of that generation, that needless expense was on frivolities like fancy frocks was wasteful. And I remember when we were little, we were taught, I and my cousins on my mother's side can recite the things we were taught as kids by our mothers and fathers: waste not, want not, a stitch in time saves nine, etc., etc. And so though that's the kind of ethic that probably Narayani, Mamvalikaladila Narayani had in her. Now, Lakshmi spoke about everyday life, and I think that is a that is the essence of this book in some sense. It's a book that's about small notes, right? It's not really the high notes. So there's stuff about travel, school, music, film, food. And it's very clear that Sreekumari's film craze rubbed off on both the sons. Hari and Amma watched Malayalam movies endlessly. And a little of which I know through my long telephonic conversations with Hari, a part of which would be a quick checklist of films that each of us had seen most recently. Now, of course, they had seen many, many more. I don't know when he worked, because he was seeing films all the time with his mother by the looks of it. But I'll never forgive him for forcing me to see an utterly depressing film called Gaddama. Did you see it? Oh, please don't ever. Which is about a very miserable life of a woman who works as a domestic. I mean, it's very worthy. She works as a domestic help in in the Middle East, and the kinds of travails of all of that. And I, in those days, I didn't know that I was stuck in a kind of Downton Abbey all the time, in my mind at least. Now I know where I am, which is I want sort of people to be living in some other period and them to be basically happy. Whatever problems they have, they should get it resolved very fast. But the high point of one of these chats was that Hari had just heard from Ravi that K.A. Abbas had made a film, the popular Paradesi, or Pardesi, based on his hero Afanasi Nikitan's travels. So that he was very excited about, and so there was even a Bollywood presence of the great man. Now, I do want to speak about food. I didn't know that, Ravi, your mother was such a fabulous cook, clearly. I mean, now I'm not surprised at all, because this is such a relish topic. There are lengthy descriptions of what was eaten. But what I found fascinating is the way in which, in her father's home, the cuisine becomes a combination of an Anglo-Indian and a Kerala meal. And this seems to have been a kind of self-fashioning that K.S. Menon seems to have done for himself. So the breakfast were eggs and pancakes and porridge and so on. And the lunch was Kerala. So they were eating oilans and garlands and erisheri and mutton, ulatyada and fish and mirkku. And I was very struck that she used the word mirkku, because usually South Malabar people say upperi, which is not really a good word, for sauteed vegetables. Now, dinner was English, so they had soups and salads and fish and chops and cutlets and pudding and so on. So it's very interesting how the entire day seems to have gone through these very different kinds of gastronomical journeys, in which you were constantly remaking yourself. There's a kind of self-fashioning through repetition and the kind of gastronomical delights that you had every single day. Now, it's also interesting that when they traveled, food was pre-ordered at Spencer's restaurant at the stations. And she says, we were served in the carriage with proper crockery and cutlery on trays. It was customary for these trays to be set with soup, a fish course, a meat dish, vegetables, and a dessert with bread and condiments. The meat dish was used to be a curry of sorts and very tasty, and the dessert a pudding. And you see, I have been feeling hungry ever since I started reading this book, and I'm trying to be well behaved and not eat much these days. So it was very tough. Now, the apparent ordinariness of everyday life, be it school days or food with the family or quirky anecdotes about siblings or love of films, is also about the world of possibilities that seem to have opened up for at least some in India at that time. Now, naturally, the social elites, of which they were one, in terms of land or caste, had education, be it in India or abroad, earlier than others. As a result, they also had better job opportunities. But even as K.S. Menon and others like him embodied both Malayali Savarna practices, especially forms of ritual, piety, and worship, or belief in astrology, this was coterminous with meat eating, openness to travel, and a great degree of adaptability. So this is very much, and I think I want to make this point, that this is very much at variance with the ways in which the Nair Service Society and now the RSS would attempt to imbue a very different kind of idea of what being Nair meant, and a kind of high Hinduness, which almost always begins with a kind of self-righteous vegetarianism. Sreekumari's recollections of her father's world, both in and outside Malabar, is about how he himself becomes a hybrid figure. And he didn't wish to return and to settle down in Malabar after his retirement, and I found that actually quite fascinating. And I think this again really makes you think about the complexity of all the categories that other kinds of history writing almost always treats as an always already given kind of category, be it caste or family or education or food. In fact, the kinds of diversity and possibilities and shifts that you see in this really disturb that to a much greater extent. I want to end this by thinking very briefly on the idea of time. Now, the personal, as in the case of many such narratives, is marked through changes in the familial, but here you have a lot of sense of time changing through travel, new schools, friendships, and so on. But even the big events are understood via the personal. So partition, for instance, she says, personally, the partition did mean my separation from one of my closest friends that I had, Mari Cardoza. I did not realize that I would never see her again, and that it would only be letters that would keep alive our friendship over the years to come. And it's in some very rare moments, and I didn't know this either, so it was really lovely to hear this, because I was very struck by this passage where where suddenly the present comes into the text. Normally you don't have the present in it, and she says, I had always loved flowers. I had loved their names and their colors, and they had been with me throughout my travel. Even today, so there's never usually a mention of an even today. It's usually sort of a kind of seamless narrative starting at point A and going on to point Y. She says, even today I remember them clearly, their petals, leaves, and buds, their structure and color, name after name. They appear before my eyes as they grew with me over time. Now, this book is written by a son in his mother's voice. Ravi points out astutely in his foreword that the only way Hari enters his mother's narrative is in the occasional phrase, I have been asked. In the many conversations Hari and I have had over the years, as I said, a constant topic was our mothers. When I heard that Hari's Amma had passed away, I wrote to him, and he replied saying, you have pinpointed the hardest part. We became good friends. But on a funnier note, it was only because of this book that I got to know that Hari and I share the same pet name, Anu. Now, it's really a very happy discovery for me, but I don't know why this was kept as a closely guarded family secret. Thank you so much.
Very nice. Super.
It is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah,
I mean, it
beautiful.
is such a wonderfully kind of
Beautiful.
intricate reading, with such care, thought, and actually an opening of the how the book opens the worlds rather than kind of hones to
Yeah.
the particularity of places, and that I think Lakshmi picked up on as well. Travel
Yeah.
becomes a critical dimension of what it meant for her life, what it meant to live, and that is absolutely remarkable. The detail, of course, is formidable. But yes,
It's amazing.
it's,
It is. It's
it
incredible.
is some. I don't know if this is more generally true, but the level of recall
This is what struck me. Yeah.
is absolutely startling.
Startling.
And there may be instances where you're actually saying, on the 3rd of March,
Yeah.
it was 5 a.m. in the morning, in 1936, this took place.
Yeah.
And it would be with this remarkable kind of sense. And there was no doubt, you actually believed it. It had to have happened.
Yeah,
And is this, I think here the temporal frame also, and the everyday,
Yeah. And also
are
when,
quite
yeah.
crucial, no? I mean, how does time actually impinge,
Yeah.
mark itself on the memory, and actually the fact that those things will not be forgotten. And it's not as if the big event.
Yeah.
No,
It's
no.
the way that
No,
percolates.
she speaks
no?
of herself as a shy person,
Yeah,
but we
and she
often
was, I
forget
think
the fact that shy people are very observant.
Observant.
Yeah.
I mean, even the way she recalls her mother's final demise, I mean, that's
course.
brilliantly
It's very
written.
moving.
Very moving.
I mean, I think, this is by the side, but I think when Amma went for her first schooling in Yerkot, it was to actually a kind of Christian school. And in fact, she was so taken up with the whole thing about hymns and the Bible, that the family got very consternated.
I
So in
can
fact, an
imagine,
aunt
yeah.
was deployed
Right, right.
to,
Bring
you
it
know,
back
to
oversee.
jingle bell.
Yeah.
Now you must oversee the kind of
Monitor.
proper education of
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
But it never went away. It was part and parcel of what she was. And I think it was that kind of extraordinary kind
Yeah.
of sense
And
of...
I think it's
and-
that
and still a
directness,
shy-
you know.
As you said,
Yeah.
it's a sheltered life.
Yeah.
huh? And yet there's this entire way in which mobility...
Yeah, but
of-
also the directness with which she says we were confirmed non-vegetarians
I
when
know,
she
I know,
begins
yeah,
a
yeah.
chapter on food. It's
It's wonderful,
marvelous.
absolutely. So, thank you so much. Both of
No,
you,
thank you.
I think, opened this text for me and in remarkable ways. Now, yes, Mrinalini, would you kindly come up? Huh? So, Mrinalini has agreed to kind of go through some of the
PowerPoint?
images here.
Yeah.
Huh? Huh?
Yeah.
And just...
Shall we go there now?
So we can
I
Since we
think
can relinquish our...
both of you can leave. I think I
Okay,
have my
good.
obligations
Okay.
still to fulfill.
Okay,
you stay at full.
yeah.
But thank you both very much. That was so moving, listening to the way you read that text.
Wonderful.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. No, actually, I don't think what I want to do is to go through the images on the PowerPoint, because it's actually fairly evident what they're about. And of course, I wanted them running in the background as a kind of treasure trove of memories down the years. And, looking at years that go beyond the scope of the book, of course, because it comes down to the present, and of course with these images to almost the making of the memoir. So but I think what I wanted to sort of open up the session to is more personal anecdotes and recountings of my grandmother as well as my father. I've of course spoken about my father in other contexts, so this would be really more about my grandmother, actually. And it's a great thing that Arunima actually brought up the case of Marie Cardoza, because that's the person I really want to start with. And I'm going to speak very briefly, but there's one specific incident I want to kind of take up, not covered in the book. Something, again, to do with my personal interactions and what I saw of my father and my grandmother during the period when she came to stay with us in Calcutta. But it's a little incident which kind of then threw into perspective so many other things which then come alive in this particular book. So this is sometime in 2018. I'm not sure many of you would recall that there was an ad that was made by Google. And it was about a young girl who had, of course, grown up hearing her grandfather's stories of life in Lahore and a world he'd left behind, pre-partition. And somewhere she managed to get in touch with one of his old friends from the other side of the border. And then, of course, through the miracles of technology, she was able to bring both these men together across the screen. And of course, today, now we are just used to Skype and Google screens and Zoom everywhere. But it so also happened that, in some ways, the public and the personal and this particular ad came to have a different resonance in my life, because it was also the year when suddenly my father received a mail from Mr. Cardoza, in fact, who was the son of Murray. And they were then based out of Australia. And, Mari Cardoza had been in touch with my grandmother through all these years when she was traveling. And then, even till the time that she was in Chennai, they had maintained very careful correspondence over letters. But of course, in the period when she came to stay in Calcutta, somewhere, they had lost touch with each other. And at some point, I think the son suggested that she would like to actually see M.Sreekumari on the other side. And somewhere in my head, I was trying to imagine a person who my grandmother would have last seen when she was 20 years old. And, she was 90 and more then. And somewhere, both of them connecting through a screen. And, what that would really mean. And I remember suggesting this to my grandmother, and she was horrified. Because the thing is that with her, I think she said that, yes, I'm just so glad that they reached out, and I think we'll exchange new addresses, and I'll figure out ways of communicating. But let's choose older ways of communicating. And I think at that point, Mr. Cardoza suggested that at least a phone call would be great. And it was such a joke because my grandmother felt threatened by even telephones. And I could never understand why, but then reading the book, I realized that she also grew up in an age when the telephone wasn't very common. And it's, through how many years that, of course, she had gotten used to things, but there were bits of the past that would come back in strange ways to me. The reason I sort of highlight this particular incident is because, as I said, of course, somewhere the public and the personal kind of come together, and it feels like life come full circle. But it was also such a pleasure to hear about these names once again when I was reading this book. And of course, it took me back to her time in Jodhpur. And in 2013, my uncle and my father managed to do something which was very precious, which was actually take her back to the space. But at the same time, I know when she came back and I kept on asking her about what she made of things, there was definitely a sense of disappointment. And the reason, again, I bring this up is because when, there was the whole possibility of this fantastic meeting of an old friend across a different screen and things like that, I also realized that somewhere she didn't want to tamper her memory of a certain space. And I think that's really important when I think of this particular book, because somewhere it was her way of going back to everything that she treasured. Of course, these places had changed, people had changed, but she wanted to hold on to the things that she remembered and how they were. And again, in that context, as Lakshmi and Arunima have mentioned, there are so many memory maps that are created in this particular book. And some of the best memoirs actually always bring that alive, whether it's Satyajit Ray writing about the house where he grew up, or Abanindranath Tagore talking about, how he was taken for his first lesson, what they call the Hatir Khori, etc. But it's literally through personal anecdotes that entire households and places come alive. Like, I was amazed to find such a detailed description of the Guruvayur temple over here. And again, the temple would have completely changed, the town would have changed, but in my grandmother's memory, it was a certain way, and I know what it was like. And similarly, as I said, it was with Ship House, it was the places she lived in with her father, the schools. And of course, another thing that's already come up is this attention to detail. And again, it's so funny because, of course, there is, on the one hand, the child's sense of wonderment, okay, about objects, and certain processes and rituals, and things, again, that, strike me as very uncommon. But for instance, my grandmother would constantly use the term head bath. And I used to be like, okay, well, it does, in my case, I've always had short hair, so I was like, I do a head bath almost every day. Bath is head bath. And then in this book, I realized why she spoke about it in such detail, because there was a whole process in which it was done at one point of time, where you would like literally oil and steam and use rose petals, etc., and which was unimaginable to me. So anyway, so there were these things, in fact, that of course came through in the book. But again, I returned to Mari Cardoza and Jodhpur because for me, this was also the point in the book where she is living through that important phase, which is partition. And there is a deep sense of people who she lost in the process. And of course, something that's mentioned right at the start of the book is the fact that this is as much about, of course, her travels and Malabar, etc., but it's also about her becoming Indian and this entire family going through that whole process. But it was also a case where it was people, in fact, who were both trying to find a new identity for themselves, and as I said, being introduced and exposed to various other communities and through their travels and, other religions, other festivals, in fact, other customs. But at the same time, there was a sense of nothing that you could also easily hold on to. Because it was a life which was peripatetic, constantly on the move. Every few years you could be moving, etc. And one of the things, in fact, that my grandmother often mentions to her, especially, I think, after that in Jodhpur and, in the phase where she kind of returns to Madras, is how she, in the absence of her mother, she became the caretaker of the house. Like, she mentions things like, dusting and cleaning and things like that. And again, for me and for my generation, it was always unusual why there was this sort of fascination with homes and housekeeping. And my grandmother was a huge fan of good housekeeping. She had, like, this time when we went back to Chennai, we found that, she'd kept all those old magazines and copies. But it was also, I guess, her way of, despite being on the move, some sense of establishing base and rootedness. And that's something, of course, that keeps on coming through. And in the context of the book, I now see so many things that she told me in new light. Yes, so that's there. But it is with that sense of rootedness that I also come to something else, and I probably am going to end with that. She also did have a clear sense of not just, of course, a world and a life which was far greater than, our individuals and their own small, petty worlds, etc. But there was also a love of nature and a sense that, things would come and go and that you would eventually have to accept that. And in the tradition of recitation, and since my grandmother was so fond of poems as well as songs and things that she remembered, again, with age, long-term memory becomes super sharp. There were times towards the end when I think the thing that kept her going, she told herself, more than, like, for somebody who loved food, she'd even lost interest in that. She didn't want to watch too many serials or films, etc., but she would keep on humming to herself. And that itself became her way of somewhere carrying on, holding on to some sense of memory. And one of the poems that she would repeat to me often, and again, it goes back to her convent education, and of course it's been a classic text for so many of us who went to school here. It's a poem called The Brook by Alfred Tennyson. So I would like to, in fact, just recite the first one or two paras, because, again, it's something that just stayed with me. I hopefully will not need to look at anything, and, in the tradition of recitation, I will remember things. So here it goes. I come from haunts of coot and hern. I make a sudden sally. I sparkle out among the ferns to bicker down a valley. By 30 hills I hurry down, or slip between the ridges, by 20 thorps, a little town, and 100 bridges. Till last by Philip's farm I flow, to join the brimming river. For men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. And I'm going to end on that note because men will come, men will go, but I hope their stories go on forever. And this book literally is that sense of a wish fulfillment. Something, in fact, I probably never managed in bringing Mari Cardoza and my grandmother together otherwise, but my father managed in the course of the book.
I can't imagine a better way of bringing a conclusion to this evening's memorial event and the celebration of two people who worked together to create a quite wonderful text. I do remember, and this I'll just finish off on a personal note, that music was indeed it was a boon. It was a kind of way in which she could actually immerse herself in a certain sense of it gave her solace, it gave her pleasure, and whatever the vagaries of the world and the kind of unsettlement in which she herself was caught up in, that itself became a reference point. In fact, she would be very disappointed if you were not. It's as if music could be a language, and it could be a kind of mode of exchange where the pleasures of actually participating in a certain type of shared knowledge and the capacity to actually kind of sing was something which she relished. And she was always disappointed in me. I'm remarkably tone deaf and incapable. But she said, "You are pretending. You are capable of singing if only you would make the effort." And I think it was about wanting an exchange. And that was something I could not offer her, but through films and other means, I hope we did. But I want to thank Arunima and Lakshmi and Mrinalini for this wonderful evocation about a life and about a way of telling a story about this life and the range of things it made us remember. At the time, if there is a place, it is the place of memory which she could go back to, and that is quite clear. That is one secure environment which shaped her. But again, thank you extremely from the wonderful turnout here, which indicates. Yes, Tapu, please.
I hadn't intended to speak today at all, but I was just suddenly reminded of something as Arunima talked about Hari being the ghostwriter, Hari trying to bring in his historian self into these. Over the 10 years that Amma came to live with us from 2011, Hari was many things to many people, but I think he was an extraordinary son. I've never seen a son care for a mother, and that's why even the details that I shared. And I was not much of a daughter-in-law. My in-laws freed me of that role entirely, so did my husband. So in a way, I looked after my mother and Hari looked after his. But there were days when I would tell him that, "Hari, you have been an extraordinary son." And there was only one thing he would say in return: "I know I've been a very good son, but I haven't been a daughter to her." And I think that summed up something, because he saw me and my mother. Hari was a son to my parents too, and I think he collected stories from them. He wanted me to begin. He gave them more time, I think, than I did at some point. And he encouraged me to become a memory keeper like him. But I think that one thing he said stayed about being a very good son, but not quite being the daughter. And it was something about, again, growing up in a matrilineal family, where he said, "I don't understand this obsession with sons, because my parents' greatest regrets were that they never had daughters." And I think this is something important to remember. But Hari was both son and daughter to his mother. That's what I will say. Just like I tried to be both son and daughter to my parents, but I don't know that I was so good at that. But Hari certainly was both. And I want to thank all of you. I think this is the biggest gathering we've had since the devastation of May 2020. We've had many online gatherings, and we've had smaller gatherings in Calcutta, which Hari made his home. But this is the first time we've had so many friends and family come together. So I'd just like to use this occasion to thank Ravi for organizing this, for Lakshmi and Arunima, both close friends, pals of Hari's more than mine, but perhaps equally mine too in a way, for wonderful presentations. Mrinalini, who was very worked up today about whether she could speak, but I think she spoke from the heart. And to IIC, to Tete in particular, again a close friend of Hari's, for putting this together. So thank you very much.